what we're really seeing beyond the culture wars is actually a battle for the finite game versus the infinite game, right? And alt-right versus social justice would assume they are on absolute, opposing teams, but they're not.
I am delighted to be joined by Jamie Wheal. Jamie is the executive director at the Flow Genome Project. Jamie's latest book is Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World that has Lost Its Mind. Jamie, I'm really, really excited to speak to you today. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, mate.
Such a pleasure. So before we jump into your book, I want to kind of ask you a broad question. We asked our Instagram audience, what do you want to know? And I think that a lot of people are kind of feeling quite fatigued about the last year, particularly here where I am in the UK. Now, COVID is kind of sort of coming to an end. We've got our own Freedom Day coming up. So I would love to know, based on 2020, 2021, what was the biggest lesson that you've learned in the last year?
Well, this isn't a cheery one. It's that if this is our dress rehearsal, we thoroughly shat the bed.
That's not good.
No, I wouldn't say it's encouraging because, we always hold out hope, for the last decade plus, every TED talk or anything like it has gone into a sort of predictable form. I mean, really from sort of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth onwards, although there was, this, you could trace this all the way back to the 70s, but it's doom and gloom, scare your audience shitless, and then go, but friends and neighbors, there's still hope if we act now. Right. And we've gone through all the if we act nows. And in fact, there was just a recent KPMG study. I mean, not directly affiliated with KPMG, but it was one of their senior managers, but then they presented it within the organization as well, revisiting the MIT early 70s limits to growth Club of Rome predictions on, exhaustion of carrying capacity of planet Earth kind of thing, which at the time got the shit kicked out of it as, neo-Malthusian, alarmist, et cetera, et cetera. And they've just reassessed its predictions based on current data. And it basically, there were three trends. I think there was business as usual, which was straight off the cliff. There was, I don't quite understand their languaging, but it was complete technology. So some like fully automated space communism kind of thing. And then there was a path to sustainable growth, sort of soft landing, and we fix this. And we're clearly nowhere near the soft landing and we fix this curves. And the only two that have any correlation right now is hard landing, like just straight off the cliff, no skid marks, or some still kind of like, techno utopian carbon sequestration, cloud seeding, geoengineering, do all the things, but we haven't invented the things that we would still need to do. And my strong hunch is that we're actually on the business as usual curve. We just haven't gone far enough along the timeline to see the divergence, because even the Paris Accords, right, are still fundamentally focused on not only has nobody actually signed up for them or done much about them, and not only are we already missing them before we even agreed to try, but even baked into them was all sorts of TBD tech breakthroughs to help us bend the maths. So that's one, connection, which is, do hard times prompt sobriety? And do we shake it off and then say, oh, okay, now no more dress rehearsals. This is really the real deal. Let's get our shit straight. The kind of proverbial World War II victory gardens and FDR and Churchill kind of stuff, which we sort of have in our dim memories, but it's getting increasingly dim. Or do we do the kind of absolute whack job fuck nuttery that happened in the UK and the US in the last 4 to 5 years, and we're now in such an epistemic collapse that no one can even agree on what shared reality is? So it just feels like a bunch of pound dogs scrapping and barking at each other in our, shit-stained prison cells. You're like, whoa, this is not good, folks. This is definitely not the better angels of our nature.
You mentioned the cliff analogy. I wonder, first of all, I guess, do you think that we've gone off the cliff? If we have, can we grow wings on our way down, or are we just going to hit the water?
It's like chitty chitty bang bang. Come on, motherfucker. Yeah, exactly. I sure hope this thing has a hydra, is a hydrofoil and has wings. Well, look, I mean, I just had an interesting and sobering conversation with a dear friend living in the interior of British Columbia. And for the last 15 to 20 years, they've been on the absolute forefront of proactive climate-informed forestry management. So it's one of the most pioneering programs in all of North America, actually. And they went so far as running, climate models, monitoring temperature shifts, moisture shifts, ecosystem shifts. They even did traveling tours to the rest of North America. They're like, okay, we're up at this latitude. We might need to start investigating what is the nearest ecosystem that we think we're growing into, and can we start actively facilitating the transition of our forest into, and they concluded that, within a few decades, they're going to start looking and feeling more like northern Utah, so several clicks down on the latitude scale. And he is now, and obviously you've probably heard of like the heat dome and the crazy things, 120 degrees in the interior of British Columbia, setting 3 records 3 days in a row. And then the 4th day, the town just burns to the fucking ground. And this fellow, this forester, who's been doing this pioneering research, is basically like, yep, I'm ready to sell everything, and I'm ready to get out of Dodge for the next 2 months. And if our entire homestead that we've spent 30 years on burns to the ground, there is no saving it at this point. And what we had forecast for 2030 is showing up in 2021. So that's just sort of real. That's not, reading something in the Guardian and getting your knickers in a twist, or, or sort of, getting all fired up by the next Greta Thunberg post. It's just sort of, just practical, very straightforward, on the ground experience. So my sense is we are in for a lumpy, bumpy landing. The question is is it at a minute, I would be very, very surprised if the wheels, if the landing gear stays on. We might get to do a belly slide on the runway and, and maybe end up in the grass, or it could just be straight fireball in. And that's going to depend on, as always, us.
I would love to ask you about this because very recently I took a break from social media. I took pretty much about a 1-month cleanse. It came to the point where, to use the language of today's kids, I was getting triggered by certain things that I would see online. And one thing that really struck out to me was that it took maybe about 2 or 3 weeks, but I noticed that the kind of inertia, the irritants that I had felt from these posts, these articles, the craziness, the way we've lost our minds in this modern world, kind of drained from my system after about 2 or 3 weeks. Right now, I feel that collectively there's a lot of global trauma, there's a lot of inertia. If suddenly we were to morph into a utopian society, how long would it take to heal from the global trauma, from that inertia? How long would it take to get all that out of our systems?
Well, I don't know if you've come across a book called The Ministry for the Future.
I haven't.
Yeah, it's a really good one. And it's actually Tristan Harris, who's another sort of our shared mutual friends, recommended it. And it's written by a top-notch science fiction writer, but it's basically realistic near futurism. And he's also part of an X-Risk think tank. So all of his scenarios are very evidence-based, circa 2020. And he basically just maps the next 40 years. And, it starts with a mass casualty heat death in India of 20 million people because wet bulb temperatures get above sustainable, and then goes into them breaking the Paris Accords and cloud seeding because they're like, fuck you guys, like we didn't create this, the industrial West did, and we're suffering. So we're no longer going to toe the lines and do that. There's a rise of eco-terrorism that starts targeting private jets and commercial flights and big diesel shipping containers, and that sort of impacts the market. There's an introduction of carbon credits that sort of replace the dollar as reserve currency. There's the establishment of wilderness corridors. There's all the things that you could imagine that would be possible, sort of mapped, and not in a Pollyanna-ish way, like lots of infighting and depression, economic crashes and all sorts of things happening. And it's not until in that model that I think 2035 that parts per million on carbon sort of dips below 450, and starts actually showing signs of recovery based on action. And I think the oceans take even longer. So at least in his description, my sense is that we could. I mean, this is bullshit conjecture, really, because what I'm about to say is instantly falsifiable. But we could heal ourselves culturally and then get to work on what is actually a longer arc of restoring ourselves ecologically. Now, the realities of that happening are slim to none because we've got, superficial culture wars over silly, silly shit like Dr. Seuss, and university curricula, and things that just simply don't matter in any remote scheme of things, which are purely distractive and the weapons of demagogues. But at the same time, there is a pig in the python, right? There is no question about it. Even if we all became Buckminster Fuller and Mother Teresa's illegitimate love child tomorrow, right? There's a massive hangover that we have to deal with that isn't going anywhere, no matter what we start doing tomorrow. And so the question but that said, were we able to live in that utopian society of yours, right? If we stopped simply spending on weapons and marketing cheap plastic shit from China that nobody wants or needs, and put all of that ingenuity and expertise and techno-economic capacity towards transitioning to sustainable energies, to ensuring food security, to pioneering energy efficient desalination, to stabilizing the bottom 4 billion on the planet, to extending compassion, care, and concern to all, to breaking the chokeholds of late stage crony capitalism. To do, could we, do we actually have the capacity? We have the capacity in spades.
Mm.
We could absolutely, and the notion of like, whether it's Elon and, the current, buzz on, billionaire space races, it's like anything that we're trying to do on Mars, you could do 1,000 times quicker, faster, cheaper here on this paradise planet we were born on. And so our capabilities to do it are absolutely there. Our will and our coherence to be able to do it are still big, giant question marks.
I love that point. And I definitely agree. I think that there's a credit card bill which we've racked up, which eventually we're going to have to pay off, as you say. I was thinking about kind of where I perceive where we are just from my own experiences of life, speaking to people on the show, in academia, in workplace. And it seems to me like in this era in particular, it seems like we've become very bad at having conversations. And because we've become very bad at speaking, we've become very bad at thinking. I would love to know, why is it so hard to kind of have conversations these days? Because it seems to me like, I was thinking about this the other day, that an alien life form, I can't imagine that they would be as emotional or as tribal and as as complicated as humans are. Why have we become so bad at speaking and communicating these ideas?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I'll take a tangential cut at this, and normally I just steer well clear of politics because it is just such an irredeemable shit show. But I'll stick my neck out to make a point, which is that I think 4 families on the planet Earth have done more to break Western civilization than perhaps anybody in history. And that is the Koch brothers, the Murdoch family, the Trumps, and the Kardashians. Right. So we'll just take them one at a time. So the Kochs, if you don't know them, it's Koch. They are a hard right, ultra libertarian pair of billionaire brothers in the Midwest of America. And for the last 30 years, they have been responsible for seeding and propagating all sorts of anti-democratic astroturf, pseudo grassroots movements, including standing up the Tea Party, which has now become a Frankenstein's monster that then morphed into MAGA and Trumpland. And they have been, as cynically as I can ever imagine, just looking to thwart and dismantle everything from public transportation initiatives to independent agriculture to democratic, school boards and everything and a sustained, incredibly well-funded campaign for 3 decades. So while liberals have been, bickering over their fucking pronoun usage, these guys have just been digging under the foundations of democracy, and then the beast they created got away for them. And I think one of them, I forget which one of them died. So I think this is probably Charles Koch after
Yes.
January the 6th, after the Capitol riots, or right around then, basically stood up and on the record said, "Hey, whoa, this is going too far. This is sort of not what we meant as the puppet masters of the universe. The beast that we've ginned up is now getting away from us. We wanted libertarian deregulation, no taxes for the for the upper class brackets. Like, we had an agenda. You guys, the mob in the street has lost lost their minds, and along with it, our interests. So they're getting a little concerned that they may get cut down too in the bloodshed. So that's one. And then in hand in glove with that has been the Murdoch Empire. And I think a couple of years ago, there was a pretty just in the crazy noise of our current media cycles, where, the 2 year in the making Mueller report gets lost in the news cycles because William Barr sits on it for 14 days and then tweets out his conclusion of like, nothing to see, Trump's exonerated. And then somehow the 14 days is up, and then journalists get to actually read the real paper and are like, whoa, there's all sorts to see here. This is insane. But somehow the news cycle had moved on. Well, in addition to that, the New York Times finally getting hold of Trump's tax records and no one really kind of bothering or caring by the time they're actually out. And there was another deeply investigative piece that they did on the Murdochs, and they sort of looked at their role buying media properties in Australia, the UK, and the US. And every single time they did, the electorate skewed 17% to the right. So they were absolutely a captive propaganda engine in those markets. And of course, all the other studies that show that if people are getting their news predominantly through a Murdoch property, they are the least factually informed, right, of any segment of the voting populace. Now you take this back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington and all that, and they were deeply concerned and skeptical of an uneducated populace having the right to vote. And there was this sort of civic responsibility to be informed. Now, newspapers and propaganda have existed since those times. The Federalist Papers and the slagging each other off in those early elections. It's not new, but the degree of pervasiveness and misinformation and the collapse of the fourth estate. So rather than that being the check and balance on three branches of government, now becomes captive and state media effectively. Like, that was a huge breaking and shearing. And of course, without Fox, you don't get Breitbart, you don't get OAN, you don't get all the absolutely wacky ass far right media properties either. Like they created that ecosystem. And and then it pains me to have to mention his name. It's like Voldemort, but like there is so much psychic tearing in the body politic and in our collective consciousness right now. And large amounts of it have sprung from a malignant sociopath and narcissist holding the highest office in the most powerful empire in human history. And normally, great men of history models tend to overplay, that is it Hitler or is it Martin Luther King or is it, whomever, and most social historians are like, oh, no, these are times and places and movements and people, and it would have been someone if it wasn't that particular person and that kind of thing. But I think in this case, you can make a case that almost every psychic tear and pathological reaction we have right now is the result of something going wildly wrong, like the Access Hollywood tape, right? You can grab women by the pussy and get away. When you're rich, you can get away with anything you want. And that motherfucker, not having his career torpedoed, as would have ever happened any other place in time, but in fact gets elected to the White House, creates this psychic tear, and then you get Me Too. And you get not just Me Too, which Clinton, Harvey Weinstein wouldn't have done it without Access Hollywood, right? You would have had like good riddance to bad rubbish, Harvey Weinstein, you suck, but you wouldn't have had Me Too. And crucially, what you wouldn't have had was the yes, all men. You wouldn't have had that sense of abandon due process, abandon innocent until proven guilty. It is time for retributive justice, right?
Right.
Because of the imbalance. The same with The same with the Mueller report and Russia, the idea that, wait, conservatives, you think back to the Reagan era, you think back to the Rocky movies, right? Arch villain, evil empire, right? And conservatives, their entire identity was in adversarial position to the Soviet Union. You've got the guy from the KGB running it, and now he's our best friend. And you're like, what's that? And then you get Mueller, like everyone's like, wait, this is crazy. What has happened? This election didn't go the way it's spent. There's all these kind of weird signals. What's happening? Here's Johnny Law. This is like Cary Grant, John Wayne. He's a Republican. He's a G-man. He's justice. Like he's the sheriff with the white hat. He's gonna look into this and he's gonna tell us what's actually going on. 2 years later, motherfucker just sort of disappears with a murmur at the end of that report. And everyone's like, wait, did he get Alzheimer's? Is this like watching The Godfather and somebody got to his kids? Like, what happened? Right. And then you get Jeffrey Epstein. And you're like, wait, the royal family and 2 US presidents deeply implicated, not like glancingly, not like an initial in a black book, but like repeat exposures. And the motherfucker dies in jail, and wait, his gods were asleep and there's no camera footage, just happened to be that night. So that creates Save the Children. That creates pastel QAnon, right? You don't get some dark, satanic, global pedophilia conspiracy without the fuel of what the fuck happened with Jeffrey Epstein, right? And his connections at the highest levels of power. So you can move through this, right? Rhinos, the fact that Trump has basically done an Orwellian flip on both fake news. He is the most documented factual liar probably in modern history and political office, and yet has weaponized fake news. I'm not fake news, you are. And keeps saying it often enough, Goebbels style, that it becomes the truth. And then he also has been pillorying actual conservatives as rhinos, Republicans in name only. And you're like, wait, no, you're a Republican in name only. You're a fucking demagogue and a populist. You spend like there's no tomorrow. You've completely upended realpolitik, NATO, global treaties. You've completely just blown up the entire post-World War II American strategic position internationally, trashed the entire Tea Party platform of fiscal responsibility. No one seems to notice, mind, or care. And yet you're tarring dyed in the wool National Review, William Buckley, conservatives as rhinos. And oh, by the way, we've got a global pandemic and it's time for us to rally together as a national response and be the nation leading the world. And in fact, we're going to say there is no federal response. And in fact, all you states duke it out among each other, which is crazy. And then, oh, by the way, we're going to actively and explicitly favor the states whose governors kiss my ass. And I will even say that. I will say that publicly too. And you're like, what? So each of those, right? Each of those have been splinters in our minds. And every single time those have happened, and then at some point, like the mainstream media just lost their mind. They're like, oh, this is asymmetric warfare. So you get the New York Times, you get NBC, you get all sorts of CNN, you get all sorts of people now abandoning their due process, abandoning their journalistic ethics, abandoning their right of response or reply, abandoning their fact checking and rigor, because they are just like, I'm just getting my ass kicked by somebody who's taking all kinds of cheap shots, and this is actually, this is material. This isn't just hits to our ratings. This is the fate of the republic. Children in cages, rapists and druggists as immigrants. Like never mind, the fact that Stephen Miller said, we're actually going to rewrite the poem on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. It was basically like, yeah, no, that whole tired, poor, huddled masses thing, sentimental, but not true. And in fact, we'll only accept the ones from Northern Europe who can afford their own health insurance. I mean, that's a condensation of a couple of public points, but right, like you're like, what? So all of those created what is known in psychology as a schizophrenic double bind, right? Which is basically, it's a child who gets abused and then coddled by their parent. Like at night I'm drunk and I knock you around, and in the morning I put you on my lap and I stroke your hair and say it's only because I love you so much. Right. And those are the grounds that create schizophrenia. And so there is no sane middle ground. So people are either collapsing into individual isolation, despair, cynicism, or they're locking onto completely factually challenged counter narratives,
Mhm.
like QAnon, like anti-vax stuff, like any of these things, where the good guys are the bad guys and the bad guys are the good guys. And now the left, the progressive left, is now leaning on the NSA and the FBI and the CIA as the good guys to help us against the bad conservatives. Like, that's never happened. Like lefty progressives have, and even the schism of the Capitol riots, you could see it within the conservative realm. Half of them are saying, fuck yeah, we took the Capitol. And the other half are saying, we would never do such a heinous thing. That must be Antifa. It's a false flag operation. So you even see the schisms within sections. So those are three we've done. We've done the Koch brothers, the Murdochs, the Trumps, and that was a unfortunately fairly chunky one there. And then the Kardashians.
Kardashians, yeah. I'm excited to hear
Right?
this one.
Well, if you think, if we go back in the Wayback Machine a decade, maybe it's a little more now, but like Paris Hilton, right,
Right,
was
right.
ridiculed for being famous, right? That wasn't the first time that phrase had been used, but for sure it stuck to her. And if you think about it, she was the heiress to the largest, most recognizable hotel fortune in the world. So she was actually kind of famous for something,
Sure.
but, released a sex tape, did all the things, blah, 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 gets a reality show. And she was vilified for being of no substance. And then her little old assistant, right, releases a sex tape, or more to the point, with her mother, coordinates and strategizes that, then shops it. And what was the subject of ridicule a decade ago, now then you get the generational thing, and then you get Kylie and Kendall. And now they are bona fide celebrities and billionaires. And you have an entire generation that has gone from, I need to make my way to earn my place, to do the hard things, to simply, I think 37% of Gen Y surveyed were saying, I want to be a YouTube celebrity. And it was like 6% wanted to be lawyers, doctors, and journalists, and those kind of things. And so that sense of, we're now getting, absolute style over substance, absolute digital narcissism encoded and reinforced, and the fact that that is no longer considered embarrassing, it's considered aspirational, and actually even the best path to the good life, has thoroughly kind of warped and distorted any form of civic balance, right? That idea of, like, I'd like to be a pillar of my community, I'd like to be respected and loved and appreciated, I'd like to be useful and of service, or even I'd like to make bank you know in the system, has all just been obliterated by, anybody can be an expert, front it before you've got it. Let me Airbnb a mansion and rent a Lambo and shoot my videos and flog some other, greater fool behind me.
A buck a
And you're
day.
just like, yeah. You're just like, oh, this whole fucking thing is broken down.
Right, right. It's a
So
collapse of grand narratives. We've all the grand narratives, the things which we had before, organized religion, the meritocracy, the American dream, it's all collapsed right in front of us.
seems to it. I mean, you could just say these are the wages of sin, and this is the last gasps of late stage capitalism. I mean, I think that there's plenty of sort of post-mortems on it, but it does seem to me that we are fairly divorced from core civic and psychosocial fundamentals at this point.
I To go back to your book to kind of tie all this that we've been speaking about together. I've read a lot of books this year. I really, really enjoyed reading yours. The book is called Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That Has Lost Its Mind. I'm going to put a link below if anybody wants to check it out. And before this, it was quite aptly timed because a friend of mine sent me an article this morning from the Times. I'll also link it below. And the article was called Why Mathematics is Racist. And, just the kind of title of your book, the subtitle, I can't help but feel like the world has completely lost its mind. What has
Mhm.
caused us to do so?
Yeah, well, I mean, at least the way I lay it out in the book is with the notion of meaning 1.0 being traditional and organized religion, which for 99.9% of human history was how we oriented to who are we, where are we, why are we. And obviously, everything from the Catholic Church, to decrease in church attendance to the rise of the spiritual but not religious is all upended in the last even decade, to the point where this is the first time in history where more people aren't affiliated as believers of some established traditional faith than are. And if you think back in the day, that was a death sentence. You were an apostate, a heretic, a pagan. You were
Right.
something terrible, usually devoid of civil rights and likely to get killed or imprisoned if you weren't a believer. So, meaning 1.0, this organized religion offered salvation at the cost of inclusion, right? If you believed, you were saved. If you didn't, you weren't. And
Right.
then post European Enlightenment, we kind of got this modern liberalism, and not liberalism like lefty, just liberalism, free markets, civil rights, property, all of those things. And that was offering inclusion at the expense of salvation, right? All men and women are created equal regardless of race, color, or creed, like at least aspirationally. But God is dead. Separation of church and state, we're not going to muddy those two things. And both have been collapsing, and especially again in the last decade, we've seen the rise of the nuns in spiritual affiliation, but we've also seen, especially in the last 18 months, right? I think if COVID did anything, it was nails in the coffin of global, secular, market-based humanism and the markets that support them, and
Right.
just any kind of, I mean, basically globalist has now become an absolute pejorative. Not a, hey folks, we all need to realize our shared humanity and work together on this little blue marble globalism, which you would think we need more of than ever. It's become an absolute epithet of the WHO, the CDC, dark and sinister plots with Fauci, and anybody else. And it's actually, you see it in YouTube comments and you're like, oh shit, and that's the rise of, basically reactive ethno-nationalism. So into that vacuum, you might think, if you were just sort of modeling this on an academic whiteboard, that this would go the way that Christopher Hitchens, that Sam Harris, and others in the kind of new atheists would have said, which is, hey, superstitious sky gods are dying. That's a great thing. We're all moving into this rational, moderate middle based on evidence and reason and facts. And you're like, yeah, that's not happening at all. Into that, sort of nature abhors a vacuum, but so does culture. And so, as the kind of roof caved in on our shared consensus, which was somewhere between traditional religious values and modern liberalism, and they kind of coexisted because the Judeo-capitalist, the Judeo-Christian Protestant work ethic-y thing, Max Weber, the whole bit, right? Like it all co-emerged, right? So
Right.
they were relatively compatible bedfellows, right? And as the roof caved in on that consensus, we're getting actually a vacuum that's pulling people to fundamentalism. So people are doubling down on even more extreme interpretations of traditionalist beliefs and extreme interpretations of brand new mutations like QAnon. Or people are getting sucked into nihilism, a complete epistemic collapse, a complete sense of apathy and or anxiety and or cynicism and despair. And you kind of get Fight Club, like let's just blow it all up or burn it all down. And so, yeah, I would say that is leaving us bereft of landmarks, bereft of both benign authority, and that's BBC One, or the Queen's radio addresses, or Walter Cronkite on the news, like somebody who will settle us down and tell us what the fuck is going on. So collapse in benign authority, but also collapse in divine authority. I mean, you've got, at this point, not only do you have more people than ever, I think that lapsed Catholics are the second largest religious affiliation in all of the United States. Right. So you've got people that have spun out and rejected the church, but now you've also got the other thing going on where you've got increasingly fundamentalist conservative Catholics rejecting the Pope and rejecting Joe Biden and rejecting all sorts of things. So there's no divine authority either that can speak with a unified voice of coherence between us. So yeah, I would say meaning 1.0, meaning 2.0, roof caved in, fundamentalism, nihilism, and the loss of both benign and divine authority have left us in an epistemic vacuum.
So much I'm really interested with it. I would love to kind of pick up on this divine authority, kind of grand narratives, which we've kind of discussed. mentioned the
Mhm,
new atheists, Hitchens and Harris.
mhm.
I feel like a lot of people now are kind of pushing towards a humanistic approach. One thing that I think about religion is that for it to stand the test of time, it must have been a socially adaptive strategy. And I potentially could argue that one of the things that they gave people was it gave people a kind of code to live by, kind of like a video game. Do this, then this, then this, and you'll progress to the next level.
Mhm.
Um, do you think that we could live in a humanistic society, or do we need to have grand narratives above us, or will a humanistic society kind of lead to this inflamed, inertia-ridden culture which we're heading towards?
That's a great question. And I feel like I read a piece in the last month where someone was making the case effectively that a secular humanist morals is insufficient. And was
Mm,
kind of, pointing to the 20th and 21st centuries examples like, look, it's not binding enough. you know and if you do need a sort of superstitious sky god who's about to strike you dead with a thunderbolt if you fuck it up, maybe so. Right, there's just a practical functionality to that. And I mean, Nietzsche took a cut at that, right, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, right. He famously said God is dead, and
God is
everybody
dead.
remembers that part. But the next paragraph is the kicker, because he's like, and be careful when you kill your gods, because when you kill your gods, you're taking them out of an entirely enmeshed system of morality, civics, and ethics. And when you whack the reason why, you actually pull the thread on the whole tapestry. And there can be hell to pay when you
Mm,
kill your gods. So that question of do we have enough of a sort of binding energy, enough of a what's the, I would say I want to say compellation, but that's not a word, but compelled to rise to the better angels of our nature? Do we have something that lifts us up? Um, because if we don't, like if you look at secular humanist morality today, at least for now, most loudly, we have the pathologies of wokeism,
right.
right? It just goes down the slide to a sort of paranoid neo-Marxism. And there's very little dignity in there. There's an awful lot of power and language games, but precious little heartfelt humanism to be found. And you're like, okay, well, left, out in the wild, you release these neat ideas into the wild, and that's what happens. We didn't mean that. Like that's going to just destroy us from within. So I think there is a question. And I've had this, I've been chewing on this one quite a bit in the last couple of years, because if you look at, on the one hand, there is an antinomian tendency to progressive movements these days, right? Like we don't want charismatic leaders. We're not willing to defer to anybody in particular to tell us what to do. And you can see this with the Occupy Wall Street movement. You can see this with Extinction Rebellion. You can see this with Black Lives Matter. And in each case, they've effectively, no sooner have they got some traction and started to influence things, that they've effectively just cannibalized themselves from within. They've
Right.
descended into infighting, power struggles, and fundamentally just, almost kind of like Robespierrean reigns of terror. Like just whoever's the tallest poppy is going to get whacked. And then as often as not, it's not like that one, the king is dead, long live the king. It's usually that person gets whacked, the squabbling continues, and then the entire movement stalls out and ceases to have any social agency or impact. And so they just all end up becalmed or scuttled. And yet, right, um, the most powerful social movements of change that we are aware of, um, like Gandhi, Mandela, King, right, did actually in fact have visionary leaders, and they played a critical role, which was to say, and each one had to sit on that precipice. They had to sit on that razor's edge, which was, do we or don't we do we go Hammurabi or Jesus, right? Is it an eye for an eye, or is it turn the cheek? And in each instance, they said turn the cheek, and their people weren't initially persuaded. And in fact, that conversation of a retributive justice versus restorative justice was effectively the dialectic of their entire careers and life arcs. And in many of those instances, they were actually killed. Their lives were ended,
Right.
right, by their I mean, in Gandhi's case, and also in Yitzhak Rabin's case, right after the Oslo Accords, right, and potentially in Martin Luther, in Malcolm X's case, who went from Black nationalist to Rainbow Coalition kind of stuff. They actually get whacked by their own people. They get whacked by like, oh no, we were backing you as long as you were advancing the interest of our tribe. But the moment you go for a pan-ethnic India, bam, Hindu nationalists capture your ass. The moment you go for Rainbow Coalition, not Black nationalism, boom, potentially Nation of Islam. I mean, messy, complicated situation with Malcolm X, but still, and the same with Rabin, right? It was a Zionist that whacked Rabin for selling Israel down the river. And so you're like, fuck, this is hard. But without them, right, without an avatar to say there is a higher, better way, which is by sort of definition, like just developmentally, there are fewer people who can hold those higher perspectives, right? How do we have grassroots-based, decentralized social movements that nonetheless rise above the center of gravity of mob mentality and impulse? Because left to their own devices, mobs regress to the mean, and the mean is mean. And so my thought, and I don't know how you do this realistically, but my thought is championing and spotlighting the infinitesimal courage, and that's actually Jordan Hall's term, right? But the idea of anonymous, faceless people doing the exceptional, and that if we can continue to showcase their stories, can we sort of almost charge up an avatar, like in magic or like in Tibetan Buddhism, where there's an imaginal entity that you send psychic energy to create and stand up to the point where you can interact with it and learn from it. Can we stand up whatever, homegrown human, generally decent person, right? Super badass who actually is the avatar of who we want to be going forward. I mean, it could be Stanley Kubrick's, cosmic child in 2001. Fuck, it doesn't matter. It just needs to be inclusive, universal, and archetypal. And can we seed it with the tales of ordinary people doing the extraordinary? Because without some North Star, we're stuffed. Right. Because bloodlust and revenge. I mean, here's the thing. People often think, like in some respects, I lay this out in the book, but it's that what we're really seeing beyond the culture wars is actually a battle for the finite game versus the infinite game, right? And alt-right versus social justice would assume they are on absolute, opposing teams, but they're not. They're both arguing for finite games, win-lose tribalism. And the global humanist project, the seeds of which were sown back in the Enlightenment, it's been a bugger up ever since. But it was a brilliant idea and maybe the best one we've ever had, and maybe the only one that could get us through this in an ethically palatable way, unless we really are just going to say, hey, 4 billion people die and it's not going to be our people, right? Which is right. People are getting bent that way already. But if we're really going to say, hey, we take an a priori ethical stand for if you were born onto this planet Earth, even if we would really love to, even if we think we've got too many of us, even if we really, never mind, if you were born, you're a child of God and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? If we accept that, then the question is how do we defend this fragile, tender notion of the infinite game? Because it is not a fair fight in the marketplace of ideas. And I think that's where progressives are flaccid, lazy, naive, clueless as to what's actually at stake, because we typically think, oh, we debate, fair side, fair reporting on both sides, all those kinds of things, and may the best meme win. But it's actually asymmetrical mimetic warfare, because all that you have to do to win, if you're on team finite game, is basically just bait or provoke anybody espousing a higher thing to say, fuck you, and I'm gonna swing back after you've poked the bear enough. And then they've won. It's like Darth Vader egging Luke Skywalker on, saying, strike me down, come on, be pissed off, come on, I'm gonna poke you, I'm gonna prod you. And the moment you take a swipe at me in anger, the dark side has won. So I win even when you win. And so it's, meanwhile, the infinite game is like, so Robespierre, I mean, again, poster boy of this whole thing, he said, famously said in the reign of terror, to justify, to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs, right? And so all the finite gamers have to do is smash eggs. That's it. But what the infinite gamers have to do, that everyone everywhere, if you don't look like me, talk like me, pray like me, but I am extending the same care and concern to you on the lifeboat planet Earth. That's putting Humpty together again. That is magnifying glasses and tweezers and super glue. And so, the finite gamers have this, second law of thermodynamics. They've got entropy on their side, and we regress under stress. So tribalism is destiny, humanism is optional. And I don't
Mm.
think that asymmetry has necessarily been fully or appropriately recognized or baked into anybody who's on Team Humans strategies at this point.
So much good in there. I would love to pick up on just a couple of things in what you said. You kind of mentioned that at the moment we're stuck between fundamentalism and nihilism. I would kind of love to pick up on this and ask if we have lost faith in divine authority, in certain things which you discuss, what should we be putting our faith in?
Hmm. Well, I mean, you can kind of respond to that in a bunch of different channels. I mean, one is for now, I think it has to be in ourselves, and it
Mm.
has to be towards our resiliency and self-sufficiency and anti-fragility. So in some respects, we are perhaps entering a period for the indefinite future, and maybe forever, where physics trumps metaphysics. Just what is coming at us requires us to deal with it and respond effectively or not in 3D. So I could be a knee-jerk libertarian. I could be a blockchain crypto enthusiast. I could be a conservative Christian or Muslim. I could, take your pick. I could be a devout QAnoner. And it sort of doesn't matter if the forest fire's coming, coming for your house. It doesn't matter if there's no more water in the well or the reservoir. It doesn't matter if we're 3 days without a square meal.
Mm.
And so it doesn't matter if the barbarians, the hordes, or the huddled masses are, at our gates, right? There's just reality is showing up. And now, it matters far less for me to go, oh, I believe this forest fire was a careless lightning strike or a drunken camper or global warming, or is this correlation or causation, or perhaps this is just a natural warming trend. I mean, fuck it. It just doesn't matter. And if we experience a massive market crash, right? Does it matter whether the libertarian is saying, well, what we actually needed was even more corporatization and deregulation? We had too little. We actually needed to really rip all the governors off. And meanwhile, you've got a Nordic social democrat saying, actually, what this indicate doesn't fucking matter if there's no more money in your bank account. So I really believe that what we should sort of worship, or what we should sort of value deeply, will be shaking off the cobwebs and cotton wool of being deconditioned zoo animals and atomized consumers, all in our rational individual identities, primed and conditioned to believe that all of our needs are valid and just and need to be met tomorrow with 2-day shipping, or we throw a narcissistic tantrum. I think basic self-sufficiency and reliance. I mean, and the stupid one would be Bear Grylls, right? I mean, you just put a placeholder like, do you know how to look after yourself? Do you know food, clothing, shelter, medicine? Do you know the basics? And if you don't, you are probably a zoo animal. And when that gate swings open, and the town is on fire and it's time for you to flee or stay in your cage, what are you going to do? What are you able to do? So that's a huge um a huge bit of encouragement. But then, the rest of the book, because I mean, it does say God, sex and death, right? It's only the first section of the book, Choose Your Own Apocalypse, that is about this kind of existential risk and cultural crisis. And the middle of the book is fundamentally, how can we reaffirm direct experience with the numinous, with some both non-ordinary state, potentially higher access to information and inspiration and those elements. And my sense there, I mean, this cuts all sorts of corners and leaves tons of things unaddressed. But if you just go from saying, hey, organized religion is perhaps collapsing because it is hierarchical, bureaucratic, and there's just a fuck ton of middlemen and friction in the system. And basically, as Michael Pollan said, we've got nothing but placebo sacraments. So there's not actually compelling renewal. Like if I go up and do the water and the wine, the wafers and the wine, I don't get a flash of God consciousness.
Right.
Right. I just do it. I think, it's the social thing. It's all the other things. So we've got placebo sacraments. We've got basically corrupt authorities, in the sense of extreme wealth, pedophilia, you name it, right? They've lost a lot of that moral high ground. And you've got an entrenched middleman priest class, none of which lead to a vibrant, self-renewing or self-perpetuating religious community or community of belief, right? So if you basically say, okay, now let's do a little neuroanthropology. How does one reliably connect to the numinous or the non-ordinary or the sublime? And if you look around the world across the last 3, 4, 5,000 years, there is a fairly straightforward set of protocols that can optimize a human nervous system to experience epiphany. And why not just share those protocols with folks, which are volatile? They're not without dangers and risks. They've been kept under wraps for very good reasons, but here they are now. We actually 21st century, neuroscience and psychology. We know exactly how you get to the magic. So why not just say, hey, humans, go there, right? Go there and see for yourself. Come back with a sort of a rational mysticism. If it, this is probably the simplest describer of it, which is I don't start ginning up fantastical stories filled with magical thinking and new or different, new or the same sky gods. But I do say, wow, fascinating access to information. That was really helpful or useful. And I try and bring it back down to the ground. And I engage in that form of check-in, renewal, healing, integration on a periodized basis, commensurate with my goals and lifestyle and responsibilities. And maybe, just maybe, that helps us be a little kinder, a little braver, a little more creative, right? And a little more cohesive together.
I've got a quote in front of me of yours, which I really love. You say, seek novelty, make art, help out. Can you double click on this for me?
Yes, but tuppence in the swear box for saying double click. But yes.
I was trying to be hip, all right?
So, yeah, I mean, honestly, that was for me that was literally sort of a post-it note written to myself for how to come back from looking over the screaming abyss, because once you really kind of deconstruct culture and socially define both senses of who we are, senses of where we're coming from, and you just kind of strip down consciousness, awareness, being, and the state of things, not just in a vacuum of like, what is it ever meant to be a monkey with clothes, but what does it mean right now, this, like in this era? That's a lot, right? And typically, when folks have peered over the screaming abyss, there's only kind of two options, right? You either come back, this is Robert Anton Wilson, but he's like, you either come back agnostic, like fuck if I know, or a madman.
Right.
You either go insane, which, in Apocalypse Now, you've got Brando's character up the river, right? He has peered over the screaming abyss. He's realized that Western American morals is completely just flimsy. It's just a construct. And he's gone cannibal, like Lord of Terror, right? And the same with Heath Ledger's Joker. Someone's like, what's your plan? He's like, plan? I don't have a plan. I'm just a dog chasing cars, man. Right? Once you realize it's all flimsy. It's all just pearl clutching morality as we whistle past the graveyards. Then you're either bent, you either go with the Nietzschean will to power. You're like, well, fuck it then. I'm just going to mess with the system because I don't believe it's real, but at least I can exert some impact or entertain myself, or you kind of go the potentially sort of, bodhisattva route, which is just, okay, I've seen over the screaming abyss and I now accept that the only thing to do, I mean, this is in some respects, it's a transcendental existentialism, right? Because I mean, Camus said, right? I mean, post ruins of World War II, right? The French existentialists, I mean, I think they kind of get a bad rap actually, because they basically said, look, it's all meaningless. Therefore, the only way out of that hellhole, right, is to actually make something, do something, be something. But make no mistake, there's no cotton wool blanket. There's no happily ever after. There's no baked in redemption. So go be a good human. And for me, shuttle running, back and forth. I mean, this is a self accepted or selected role, so I can't bitch about it. But kind of doing the scouting missions back and forth, are like, what do I think is coming? Holy shit, that looks grimmer than anybody else is talking about, or at least more than a handful of people. Coming back to communities, coming back to public conversations, and sort of feeling like, well, I cannot simply be freaked out and despondent. That's not useful, right? So where's the thread of hope? Right, because in some respects you have to metabolize that, and you have to come back and be like, okay, it's it's the hour's late and the stakes are high, but I think there's a way through, and here's the way through. And at times that gets too much. At times, like, I'm like, fuck it, I'm not seeing the way through. And so in those instances that I've just felt like flat on my back, what's the point? Right, I just do that checklist, like seek novelty. Like, we are hardwired to explore. We are hardwired to discover what's new and what's next, to basically lean into the adjacent possible. And that's literally the level of like dopamine encoding. And people are probably fairly familiar with this, but Sapolsky's work at Stanford and other places, which is, you're rewarded for finding the honey or the bright berries or whatever it is, right? Or the available mate and dopamine, right? But then over time that tapers if you're just continuing to go back to the same slot machine. And then you basically get, up to 400% boost and reaffirmation when you go discover something new that is uncertain or unsure. So we are literally novelty seeking engines. And when our novelty seeking tapers because we're in a working rut, or we've been stuck in our house in quarantine, or we're spending all of our time surfing social news sites or whatever it is, and novelty, flatlines, our sense of aliveness flatlines with it, and therefore purpose, and therefore validation in being alive. So go see a sunrise or a sunset, watch a meteor shower, travel if we can, learn to do something new, like just the simple obvious, but seek novelty. And then make up. We talked about entropy, when we were talking about Humpty Dumpty and asymmetrical meme warfare, but there is also just the sense that, the entire universe is spiraling down to heat, death, and decay. Right. And whether, or Shelley's Ozymandias, look on my works, ye mighty in despair, like, fuck, best laid plans of mice and men, right? All of it. So there is a sense of, no matter how hard I try, nothing comes of this. You're young, you're idealistic, you're romantic, you get married, you settle down, you have a mortgage and children, you get spat out into late middle age, you're going to get old and die. What the fuck? Like that whole kind of ennui of modern life can break you as well. The sheer futility of, and to get back to Camus, right? I mean, he said, and you have to imagine Sisyphus is happy pushing that fucking rock, right? You have to imagine he's actually got a reason. And I think part of it is because Sisyphus made pushing that rock his art. And and that idea of, I am going to do something, I'm going to organize matter in 3D against entropy. I'm going to make it more coherent, I'm going to make it more good, more true, or more beautiful, so that I can look upon it and not despair. I can look upon it and say, I was here. I can look upon it and say, I made a difference. And art doesn't need to be oil paints, or black and white photography. It could be planting a garden. It could be hosting a dinner. It could be raising a family. It could be writing the great American novel or anybody else's. It can be anything that is increasing order, goodness, truth, and beauty. Just to simply say, look, left to its own devices, it wouldn't have done this. And I played a part. And between the novelty and the making art, those are, to me, they never fail as a diagnostic of why I'm feeling out of gas, despondent, undermotivated. I'm like, no, okay, yep, you're right, no question about it. Either I'm distracted from the art I have to make, and I'm kind of pissing and moaning, or I'm doing something else, or I'm getting lost in more research, or more doom scrolling, or more bitching about the state of things or people or whatever. But just fucking shut up and go make it, and novelty. And the final one of helping out is just if you've wrapped your head around those first two, share it. Just share it. And, yes, there's optimal psych reasons of like helpers high and justifications for how meaningful that is, but just be a good person and share it, or the Bob Marley thing of my cup overfloweth and I don't know what to do, right? You like, just go shine your light. Because if you're pursuing novelty and you're making testaments to the beauty of this experience, that's magnetic, that's attractive, and it's also deeply needed. So it could be anything from I'm publishing a book or I'm exhibiting in a gallery, or it could be big brother, big sister, helping, orphan kids, or working in a soup kitchen with a twinkle in your eye. Like there's 1,001 ways for us to help. And all we need is to have the first two alive in us to be an embodiment or a metronome, right? That other people can align to and pick up the beat from.
There's an awful lot of wisdom in those 6 words. I really want to thank you for sharing that. I appreciate we're sort of coming to the end now. So I just want to ask you a quick fire questions, which we always blitz through. So today we were speaking about your latest book, Recapture the Rapture. I can see a load of books behind you. I can recognize a few of them. Which books have impacted your life the most, Jamie?
Stranger in a Strange Land, which is all about a human, fundamentally doing religion 3.0, right? He's trained on Mars, but has yogic capacities, and it was a cult classic in the 60s. Probably Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which was another key 60s book, but all about Ken Kesey and the rise of the merry pranksters, and that whole sort of Wild West psychedelic movement. Most recently, I would say Alice Walker's Temple of My Familiar, which is fundamentally just an epic on how to love through brokenness, and how to transform suffering into joy. Most recently, The Ministry for the Future, which is a future casting book about the next 40 years. I found that really helpful. I said that's plenty to start with.
My last question today, before I kind of ask you to sign off and signpost these guys to wherever you'd like them. Question we sign off all our podcasts with is, what makes a life worth living?
I'm thinking through anything that doesn't sound like a sort of pat cliche to try and get to the thing. But it's fundamentally sucking the marrow out of it and not dying wondering. And I think what makes life worth living is to this isn't a tautology, is to realize that life is worth living. Like, rather than where I am right now isn't yet, and that someday everything's gonna be different when I paint my masterpiece and I go off scuttling around this world trying to accumulate what I think I don't have, to actually truly come back around and say, this is the miracle, right? This is the majesty. And I am all in every day for the full catastrophe.
I love that. I love that. Jamie, I want to pay my gratitude to you because I loved your book. I love the work in which you're putting out. One thing I particularly appreciate is how you have the ability to dissect very, very complex scientific studies, cultural narratives from across an interdisciplinary of fields, and you've woven them into a fantastic book. And I think people are really, really going to love it. So I want to pay my gratitude to you and for the work in which you've been putting out there.
Oh, thank you, man. I appreciate you taking the time to check it out.
My pleasure. Jamie, where can these guys connect with you, and where would you like to signpost them to?
Yeah, recapturetherapture.com is the simplest place to go. You can obviously buy the book on Amazon, do whatever, but there's also like free toolkits and and guides and things that help you make sense of it. And then for any of our community and our actual real world trainings, Flow Genome Project wheal.com. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, various places like that. And I just, an encouragement is, from what we've heard, feedback from readers is it's that much better to listen to the book on Audible, which I also got to read, versus just having it as text, because it just helps it go in. It's not dense in the sense of academic, but it is dense in the sense of ideas per page. And that can be a really helpful way for people to get the most of it.
I love it, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, man. Glad to be here. Fun conversation.